to On Becoming a Healer. I'm Stefan Kertes with my co-host Saul Wiener. Each episode in this podcast, we talk about keys to becoming an effective healer and helping others become effective healers. Through stories, we focus on themes of engagement with others, boundary clarity, healthcare decisions, humility, and other attributes necessary to being an effective healer. Today, we do have a guest, one of the people featured in Saul Wiener's book, On Becoming a Healer, Dr. LaMenta Conway. Hi, Saul. Why don't you introduce Dr. Conway, or LaMenta?
Yeah, thank you. So in the book On Becoming a Healer, I have a chapter called Healers Are Realists, with a nice quote by Simon Oster, which says that idealism often precedes burnout, which is somewhat counterintuitive. But the idea is that people who often go above and beyond, and by that I mean they make an effort to heal the world, to take steps to address inequities, are often not starry-eyed idealists. They're often quite pragmatic. But over time, they build skills at solving problems. And then eventually, when they see a need, they kind of have the skill set to approach it in a very practical way. And LaMenta is just an incredible example of that. She's one of three people who are profiled in that chapter. And I'm delighted that she's going to be joining us today for this interview to talk a little bit about her foundation, the I Am Able Foundation. We're going to be setting this up as a conversation where we first get to the heart of this, which is her own story and how she came to see the need for a foundation based on her own challenges, coming from a community where very few people became physicians or even went to college, and having to kind of pursue that journey with really no guidance, no mentorship, and just none of the advantages that, well, certainly that I had, that you had, Stefan. And just discovering once she succeeded in that journey that there was an opportunity to make it easier for those who follow. LaMenta and I first met when I was the director of a residency program. This was in the 1990s, believe it or not. And she was just coming out of medical school. And that's how we met. I actually admitted her to our residency program. And this was a combined program in internal medicine and pediatrics. And I was just amazed when I met LaMenta. And I think that'll become clear as to why. When she was a resident, one of the things that I remember was that in clinic every week, we had just a whole variety of patients coming in, but in general, it was a clinic that served the underserved. So most of our patients came from disadvantaged backgrounds and struggled to get into appointments and had other priorities. And we had about a 40% no-show rate in our clinic overall with the 16 residents who were there. But remarkably, almost nobody missed their appointment with LaMenta. I would say it was almost like a 90% show rate. And we used to laugh about it because it would kind of run her ragged. I mean, everybody else would be twiddling their thumbs because they had a lot of patients not showing up. And LaMenta always had all her patients come in. And I think that's just gives you some sense of how she was perceived by her patients. They were going to get to her hell or high water. So LaMenta now, many years later, is the founder of this foundation we'll be talking about. She's also the deputy medical director of the Illinois Department of Corrections. She has been a practicing internist and pediatrician in a variety of roles. And I just don't know how somebody does all those things. But we're going to be talking about her journey. I think Stefan is going to ask her some questions to get us started. And then we're going to kind of shift from there into a conversation of her foundation. So Stefan and LaMenta, first of all, LaMenta, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, we're really happy to have you join us. LaMenta, tell us about where you grew up and how you grew up.
I grew up on the south side of Chicago in a community called Inglewood that was actually known for all the things that you don't want a community to be known for. The daughter of a woman who worked in the post office, but worked in a variety of laborer types of jobs for many years, and grew up in a community where there was a lot of drugs, a lot of gangs, and a lot of struggles. But in the midst of all that, I also grew up with a wonderfully supportive family, which consisted primarily of my mother and my grandmother and my grandfather. So some very powerful matriarchs and patriarchs in my family who actually helped to provide an extremely supportive environment. And if you had to grow up where I did, you would want to grow up with them.
When you talk about growing up in Inglewood, did you feel in any way that you were facing personal risk or threats of any kind that could get you?
Yeah, I did. I remember one particular day, I was a really little girl, and I remember a big fuss going on the porch, and I ran down there, and my big brother, who's quite a bit older, 9 and 11 years older, are my brothers, and my mother was out there on the porch, and there was a lot of, loud conversation back, and there was this huge assembly of young men who were basically trying to get my brothers to join a gang. One brother in particular and his best friend that was more like a brother to me. And I remember that exchange because my brothers refused, well, one of them refused to acknowledge the gang name. And because of that, they were threatening to come down. They said that they would, if my brothers did not actually indicate that they were a part of this gang and agree to it at that moment, that they were going to come back and burn their house down. And I'll never, ever forget that moment, how afraid I was. I probably was around 6 years old. And the interesting thing that happened is that my grandfather, who had already gone to bed for the evening, came running down and he confronted the young man. And the weird thing that I guess we don't see today so much, sadly, is that there was still just a semblance of respect for elders. And just because my grandfather came down, they left. But I'll never forget that moment when the young man, as they were walking away, it was probably a group of about 15 of them, he says, well, we're going to come back and burn your house down. And I remember being sleepless and afraid, but nothing happened. But it was just one of those moments where I was proud of my brother looking back, obviously, because they didn't buckle to the pressure, the gang pressure, but at the same time, there were consequences that could have affected all of us. That's one of my earlier childhood memories. Is one of the more disturbing ones, but I also have great memories because I grew up in the church, and as we often say, the Black church, and I would say that that was probably the single community force that anchored, our community. So for everything that may not have been going the best in the community, the salvation, the peace, the joy was all found in the Black church. Is where where people actually told me that I was somebody and that I had gifts. So I would say that that was a place where my confidence was built up. I'm a singer. I'm a gospel singer, and it's first place that someone handed me a mic, whether I was a great singer at the time or not. They were. It was a very forgiving place to learn, and I remember, that being the first place that I sang, was given a mic and discovered that talent. It was the first place where I began to teach. I taught Sunday school. I used to do plays for the community, for kids in the community, to keep them involved and off the street. I had a lot of leadership roles, even as a young kid, which was very interesting. But they had a lot of confidence in me. And that was, I would say, that was the structure that balanced off of many things in the community that weren't so good, the poverty and some of the hopelessness that we all were experiencing at the same time.
Yeah, what I hear in that is sanctuary, nurturing, acknowledgement, credit.
Right, exactly. And I would say it was also the only place where those in our community that were college educated, where I'd find them. There weren't many, but there were a handful, and a handful, I'm going to say less than a handful, and those that were there, because the majority of people were working class persons, but those who I remember that stood out to me was an aunt of mine and a close friend of hers, because they were teachers. And they were actually our only example of college educated people, that we could actually look to and say, hey, that might be something that I might consider doing as well.
I'm going to mention that I did not have such a challenging upbringing in that way, but perhaps faced my own challenges. And oddly enough, it was in Sunday school and at the Temple Choir, junior choir of Temple Beth Am in Los Altos Hills, where I felt important.
I think the church has been a landmark, an institution, and there is something special about the Black church, for all of its flaws, but more actually the beauty. I really would say that that's where so much of my strength and my foundation and my all of the encouragement that I received was in the church. You asked me about, growing up, and one of the things that I can say now, looking back, I don't know if I thought about it at the time, but I grew up in a time where times were really hard. I mean, before my mother ended up working at the post office, again, I mentioned she was a laborer. I think she worked at some stores like Old Cedar and, from the broom store that doesn't exist, I don't think anymore. And I can distinctly remember a time when my brothers and myself would actually scour the neighborhood for bottles. I don't know if they do that anymore, but we would find bottles, and that was kind of like our a big deal for us. And when I say bottles, I mean like soft drink bottles and things like that. And we would actually return them to the store in order to get a little extra money to be able to feed ourselves at the end of the day. So those are some things that I remember. Other things that I remember about my childhood that I think I'm more aware of now than I was then is that I actually didn't have a doctor. I don't remember. I think the first time I actually ever went to see a physician that I can recall at all was probably when I was 16 years old and I had this huge effusion on my knee, and ended up having some peri-surgical types of procedures in order to improve from that, and early hospitalization from a viral illness back when I was around 16. But that was the first time that I actually ever remembered having my own personal doctor.
That is pretty stunning to me. I know that you wanted to be a doctor, but from when did you think that was a possibility for you?
I wanted to be a doctor after watching, and I always tell the story with the foundation, and only a few hands go up when I ask who's ever heard of Marcus Welby, MD. And I hate telling the story in a way because I know that, all of the millennials completely do not know who I'm talking about. And in fact, if they're under 40, they don't know either. At any rate, I used to watch Marcus Welby, MD, as a little girl. But I remember looking at him and saying that I'm going to be a doctor just like him. And it's, I often tell people that I think sometimes our dreams and visions are like implanted deep in our spirit and our soul, because it is my firm belief that you have to see it to be it. Like you really need to see living examples in order to be what you actually visualize. And I didn't have that. But I'm very thankful that I had a glimpse of something that I was able to hold on to long enough until a true mentor would actually be in front of me, live and in person. But for me as a little kid, Marcus Welby, MD.
One thing that I know is you were in a program in high school, through a Catholic high school, where if you did well, you could go to the University of Chicago for college.
Well, it wasn't a program. It was, again, this was one of these crazy dreams that I had, just like being a doctor, right? So all of a sudden I'm in Chicago. There is right there within reach the University of Chicago. And there was something about me as a kid that always aspired to all of these lofty things. And why couldn't I reach out for something more attainable? I don't know. But same thing for medical. I want to be a doctor, and nothing else would do. And then all of a sudden, I'm thinking about colleges, and it has to be University of Chicago. Because of all of what University of Chicago represented. But when I really look back and I think about it, I think one of the reasons why I wanted to go to University of Chicago, because again, we talk about you have to see it to be it. Well, also it's the things that are around you. A lot of kids from the inner city never even think about going away for college. And that's true of not just myself and the kids in my community if they even finish high school, but it's even true for the kids in my foundation today. And I think that I looked at University of Chicago because it was just simply a stone's throw away. And here I am living on 69th Street in Inglewood, and I'm looking at University of Chicago, and it's this wonderful institution, and I'm thinking I want to go there. And so I chose that on my own. I didn't actually, there was no program, and with no guidance from my counselors, because my counselors are the ones that discouraged me from even applying to schools like University of Illinois or other state schools. I was told never even bother because you'll never be able to get into any of those schools. So that was the kind of guidance I had. So University of Chicago was just my own dream and my own wacky, quacky, vision coming from nowhere, it would seem. And so I applied. I took the CTA bus over there, a bunch of buses, and whatever it took to get there from my house. And I felt like I walked into a new world, the Gothic halls, and I mean, it was just amazing, and it was everything that I had ever envisioned. And I still remember to this day the admissions counselor I talked to, and how we actually sat there and had such a warm conversation. And he told me, your grades aren't bad, but you're not quite where most of our admitted students would be. So this is what I would say. If you would just get all A's and B's next semester, we'll offer you a seat. And that was pretty much a huge motivating factor, and pretty much a dream come true. And I remember going back to school and just putting my heart and soul into doing really well, my understanding of what really well was at that time. But I knew for sure some few concrete things that I had to do really well, and that I needed to get B's and A's. And I focused on that. And to my surprise, at the end of this semester, I ended up getting 1C in biology. And I was astonished. I was shocked. I was disappointed. I was devastated. And I was surprised because in my mind, I did everything right. And my mother was, of course, in support of me. We decided that we would go up and talk to the teacher. And the teacher told me that no, I didn't actually meet the criteria. But you know what? He never showed me why. And unfortunately, I didn't know how to protect myself. I'm not sure if I would have been successful anyway. I didn't have all of my tests, and I didn't write everything down, and I didn't have a paper trail. And so when I went to speak with him, he just basically said, no, you didn't meet the criteria. And he dredged up a few numbers, and none of which really kind of added up in my mind. But the long and the short story was that the answer was, no, this is the grade that you had. And I remember telling them, but my whole, I'm on a waiting list for University of Chicago, and I have to have B's, and I did well on this test and that test. And he said, well, I'm sorry, your overall grade is just not, it's not a B. And he said, and if they wanted you, they'd just let you in. And they didn't. So, I can't help you. And that's a moment that stood out. I had a lot of unfortunate moments like that with, that was a male white teacher.
Yeah. So tell us about these hints that you didn't always have teachers who were supportive of you. Who were those others, or what were those kinds of situations?
So I ended up going to a Catholic high school in the suburbs of Chicago, south suburbs, because my mother mistakenly believed that somehow being in an environment with mostly white people would mean I would have a better education. That's a sorry testament to how many of us believe, but that's the case. And I ended up, in a place that I didn't really feel at home at all. Every day we would ride on the bus, and there was racial tension because we sadly shared the bus with boys who went to the Catholic high school that was across the street from us. And there were physical attacks from those white boys on the black girls. I do remember a hazing experience where we got on the bus and they start spraying shaving solution all over our hair. And
Oh,
if you know
God.
anything about black women, and if you don't, I'll tell you, you don't do nothing to our hair, because our hair is already a work, a big work, and it is not an easy work. And the one thing you don't do is start spraying things into our hair. And that I'll never forget that first day that violence erupted, because I don't think that they were being chummy and friendly. Actually, I think they were being antagonistic, because they came in specifically spraying things on black girls, whom they didn't know, didn't have a relationship with. And I felt like it was exactly what it was meant to be, which was intimidating and not playful. But that's one of my moments that I remember. But on that same bus where we were being actively antagonized by these white boys that were going to our brother's school, we would drive every day past a building in the now Marquette Park, which was a 3 flat. And on the side of the building, because there was an empty lot next to it, in the boldest and the largest print possible, it said "Niggers go home."
Oh,
And
gosh.
it was so interesting as I look back in time to think how we, as 14 and 13-year-old kids, were riding past this signage every single day for years while I was at that school. And the interesting thing is that none of us ever talked about it. Like there was never a conversation, even amongst the Black girls, about, hey, that's not right. That shouldn't be there. But it was a silent acceptance of the reality of our life at that time. And I feel like that's played a role and played a part in how I processed things and processed my pathway. And I think it's one of the reasons why, a lot of Black kids never try to do certain things, because there's a silent acceptance that there are real barriers and that you can't really cross over them. Just something that I happen to remember. I remember sitting in a classroom with one of my biology instructors or teachers, and I remember that I answered a question and I apparently didn't answer it correctly. And he made fun of my answer. And because he made fun of my answer, I felt at liberty to do something that I wouldn't normally do, because I was from a very respectful culture. And I remember saying something I would never say even, and that's why it stands out. And I said, that's cornball. It was my way of trying to defend myself against what I thought was a harassing response to my answer. And when I said that's cornball, the teacher says, not cornball, cornbread. And I will never forget the laughter that ensued in the entire classroom. And that I don't even think that it was an uncomfortable laughter for most of the students. I believe that they felt like it was okay to laugh like that. And I remember a slight chuckle that I had, even in his response, because I had to make it seem like it didn't bother me that much. But I did go home and talk to my mother and tell her about this place. It wouldn't be until later that I understood what a damaging experience it was to be in a majority white environment where I didn't actually think that we were welcome or wanted.
When the teacher says back, not cornball, that's cornbread. It's a power move of certain kind.
I think it was a power move, but it was also a move that was meant to put me into a certain place and category, because cornbread is supposed to be a phrase that should be synonymous with, I mean, everyone eats cornbread, right? But cornbread is a part of the soul food era and is supposedly Black. And I feel like that was his way of telling me who I was, not cornball, but cornbread.
Although, yeah, now I get it.
So he simplified my whole world. Basically, he simplified my whole existence to cornbread, and that was,
That's your cornbread. It's, yes.
yeah, my cornbread exactly. And that's what I took from that experience, and that's what he meant by it, also.
I got it now. Yeah, coming from California, I don't think I fully realized that as you were just telling the story. So you went to college, and where did you go?
I went to DePaul, and I had a decent experience. I think that it still was, more wandering through the wilderness, but I think I met people that would change my life and be a part of my life in a powerful way in terms of friendships and growth and spirituality and those things. And for that, I think DePaul provided me the kind of opportunity that I needed.
When you went to college, how did you pay for it?
My first year of college, I had an assortment of loans and Pell Grants. So my first year in college seemed to, be manageable. I'm like, okay, well, we looks like we can pull this off. But my second year, Ronald Reagan actually, he completely eliminated Pell Grants. And mind you, I had a single mother as a parent who was making very minimum amount of income working at the post office, and it really wasn't possible for her to actually pay for me to go to school. I'll never forget going into the financial aid office and saying, I can't make it like this. I said, I just can't. I said, can you please help me with the money? It's like, no, I'm sorry. The Pell Grants were cut. And I think that between a combination of increasing my loans, as well as I began to work, and eventually I began to work full time, that's how I actually paid for my continued tuition at DePaul.
That's pretty stunning. And it's even more stunning. And I don't know if we should use this, but Reagan massively boosted defense spending, which essentially paid for my college because my father worked for a defense related industry. I've often said my pathway through, as the liberal person that I am, was paid for in part by Reagan's defense spending. It's literally a wealth transfer from, I guess, one from you to me, or from one sector of society to another.
And you can add to that. I remember my mother actually on. This was a little bit later on, but this was later on. But a similar thing happened again because he was in office for a little while. When she was preparing to retire, he ended her. And I remember how excited she was about being able to retire finally after decades long of working. And he then cut her Social Security because they called it double dipping. And I'll never forget the impact that had. Like these are very specific moments that people don't think about. I mean, these moments actually impact people's lives. And I remember all of her Social Security because for many years before she even went to the post office, she worked in the public sector and she accumulated Social Security and she lost the majority of that because they had determined that she and other people like her were double dipping. And and I do know that he continued to receive his retirements from, I believe it was California, from state of Illinois, and of course the governmental federal retirements as well. I've been told that it was 4 retirements in all, and people like my mother was affected. So those are some of the things that I remember as a young person.
It's galling. But let me ask this. By the end of college, you assessed you could not go on to become a doctor. Why not?
I think that somewhere around my sophomore year, I had an aha moment when I was standing next to some young ladies who had gotten A's on their tests, and they were talking about, "Hey, I got an A. What did you get?" "I got an A." And I was thinking to myself, people passed this test? Like they actually passed this test and got A's on it, and I began to listen to them, from off the side. And she's like, "Oh," one of the young ladies said, "Yeah, I studied 6 hours," and the other was like, "Me too." And then I did all the questions, and they were going over and rehearsing basically their success story. And I'll never forget the moment that I realized that people were putting in more time than I knew was actually needed. I didn't know that I needed to study like that. In my mind's eye, I felt like if I read the book and I answered some of the questions, that was what studying was. And I had no idea the amount of repetition, the amount of practice questions, the amount of group studying and challenging their knowledge that was going on. I had no idea into that moment, like none. And I had vowed to myself that I was going to change things around now that I realized what people were doing. And I began to work on just those things and remediating some problems that I had. But by the time I got through the end of my college career, which would take me 5 years, I was really, really tired. I had the last 2 years of college, I got mostly A's and a handful of B's at that time because I had just purposed in my mind that I was going to figure this out and I was going to do better and I was going to be successful in my grades and turn everything around. But I think what happened was once I got to the end, I just looked back and I realized that because of my previous failings that I just couldn't do it. Like no one would ever overlook all of these mishaps and these bad grades. And I just gave up. And I remember at graduation, I was already married. I got married during college. And I remember my husband walking up to me at the time. We were both pretty young, obviously. And he's like, "Sweetie, now you have to go to medical school." And he said that, as if he thought that that would be my next step. And I looked at him puzzled. And I think I really was puzzled. And I looked at him and I says, "Read my lips in my best George Bush voice. I will never, ever go to school again." And I can't believe I said it even then. I didn't know I felt that at that moment, but it was the the culmination of disastrous years is the way I looked at it. And I was exhausted. I felt like I didn't have anything else in me. I felt like, you know what? I am the first person in my family to go to college. One of the few people, even on my block that I came from, that even graduated from high school. I've done enough. I've finished. I've gone farther than everyone else around me. And this is good. I can stop here. I have to stop here. And I think mostly it was because I didn't think that there was a pathway. There was no clear pathway for me to actually make it happen. I had my chance. I didn't understand what I needed to do, and I blew it. And I felt like it was over.
Was that a moment where you felt defeated? Would that be the right word? Or is that too much?
No, that is exactly the word. I felt defeated, and I actually had spoken one time at an event, and I was a keynote speaker, and the word that I used was tired. I was just tired.
Anybody listening to that would hear enormous power in all that you had done to that moment. And I think most people with a heart would also feel like it's horrific that somebody would feel like, okay, I have to cut my dreams now. Age 21, that's a hard moment.
Right, exactly. But I decided that I would, I would move on. I was walking at a job fair one day, and the Illinois Department of Public Health was at this job fair. And I decided to go ahead and apply. And that actually was a life changing moment for me because it was while I was working at the Illinois Department of Public Health at the Division of Labs that I met a lot of people who shared that dream of becoming a doctor, but ended up on this peculiar detour like me, where they, for any number of reasons, their dreams died there too. And it was a powerful place of reflection because here I'm looking at all of these people and all of them wanted to be doctors and all of them are working in the lab, streaking plates and they found a level of contentment. And I remember thinking, well, man, they're okay with this and I'm still not okay with this. So that was one of the aha moments and a couple of things that happened while I was there was number one, I met a young man who actually connected me to a mentoring group that actually was the point of change for me. And number two, I had a particular moment where an infectious disease physician called and he wanted to learn more about the isolate that he had submitted. And I remember sitting on the phone and answering all of these questions. And in my arrogance, I guess you would say, and ignorance, it was both at the same time. I thought to myself, this guy's not that smart. I should be on the other end of the phone. And it was one of those crazy moments that I'm so thankful happened because in my little childish young mind, I thought that any doctor would know the answer to all questions, right? So they were very smart. And why is he asking me all this? He should know this because he's a doctor. And I didn't understand that he probably was a pretty brilliant infectious disease doctor to even take the time to bother to call a reference lab just to even discuss these, the results that specifically. But I didn't understand that at the time. And that was a powerful motivation because I'm like, man, these guys aren't all that smart. I mean, if he can do it, maybe I can do it as well. And that was one of those unique aha moments for me.
You had to, of course, put together a portfolio, including an essay to apply to medical school. What was that the first time? What changes did it need?
So that's as I skip ahead because I actually applied to medical school a few times. So I applied after I met a mentor and the CHAMPS program, which really changed my life and my trajectory. I actually began my studies at the School of Public Health, working on my master's in public health in biostats and epidemiology. And so that was one of the things that kind of turned things around for me when I first began to realize that, hey, maybe I can do this. So I started studying, doing really well in my classes, and I applied to medical school. And I didn't get accepted the first or the second time that I applied. And I had pretty much given up. And I decided to apply a third time. And I was actually pregnant with my third child at the time. And I went in to take this test, the MCAT, because my husband told me I had to take it again and I didn't want to deal with it. But I realized that that was probably the reason why I didn't get in the first two times, that my MCAT just wasn't strong enough. And so I ended up preparing to take the MCAT, and I actually went in to take the MCAT. And I remember walking in with a headache that probably was close to a 10 out of 10. It was the most excruciating headache that I ever really recall having then, even up to now. And I was really threatening to leave even because of that, because I felt so sick. And I remember starting with the test and not really knowing anything on this test. The first question, the second question, the third, fourth, all the way to the 10th question, I really didn't know anything, or at least I didn't feel like I knew the answers to any of the questions. And I began to cry on the Scantron because things weren't computerized back then. And I remember just kind of stopping and pausing and praying. And I remember feeling like I didn't even have time to pray. There was like this distinct messaging like, hey, you don't have time to pray. And then I remember a certain comfort coming over me and saying, hey, you don't have time not to pray. And I remember sitting in this room and all these tears flowing down my face. And I had come to a real fork in the road. And I asked the Lord, I said, I don't have any faith anymore. I am depleted. I am empty. I am at my last chance. I've applied twice. This is where the rubber meets the road. This is it for me. And I don't have no walk on water faith. I don't have any Daniel in the lion's den faith. I don't have any Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego faith. I mean, this is really what I was praying. I said, I have nothing. All I have left now, Lord, is for you. I said, if you don't mind, can you just give me what I put in? I've been working so hard, and I know I have to know more than what it seems when I'm trying to take this test. I have enough faith to ask you in your mercy and in your grace to please give me what I put in. You don't have to give me anything that I didn't earn. But I was asking God to help me get past the fear and the discouragement so I could just at least focus, and that which was in me could just come to the surface and that I could give my very best performance on that day. And I remember turning the paper over and I didn't know question 11 or 12 or 13 either. But for some reason, after I prayed, I had this renewed faith that somehow it was going to be okay and that I should just keep on reading until I found something that I knew. And then as I did that, I began to recognize questions, answer questions. And I knew them, like I answered them correctly. And when I began to answer them correctly, I went back because it suddenly came to me, you actually know the questions 1, 2, and 3, and 4 also. So I started going back and filling in the dots. And imagine, I almost left out, like I almost walked out of the test. But instead, after taking that moment to reflect and to pray, and to give it one more time, I was actually able to go back and complete the test and do well on the test. And I actually ended up scoring in some sections in the 98th percentile or the 80th percentile. And that was my moment.
Wow.
And that followed around the same time that I went in I was in a special program from the CHAMPS program, God bless the CHAMPS program, which was a mentoring program at the time. And through my relationships with people at the state, that's how I learned about the program. And I ended up spending the summer at one of the major medical schools in Chicago. And I feel like I met 4 angels there. Like God actually put these people there for me specifically. And I'm glad that I thought that much, that God loved me that much is the way I look at it now, that he would do that for me, that there are people that are, here on this earth whose lives will intertwine with yours in such a special way that, yes, they're here for you. And I like to think that I'm here that way for other people. And one person that stands out in a way that has impacted me even to this day was a beloved woman by the name of Irene Turner. And she was a firecracker. She was a medical assistant or not a medical assistant, a medical technologist that actually was doing a lot of work that I used to do, in the labs and so forth. And she was doing that at Rush, but she became very active in social programs in the city. I mean, wherever there was something powerful going on, she typically was a part of it just as a community servant. And she also found ways to insert herself into that same type of positivity at Rush, where I was attending. And I will never forget that I always thought that one of my better skills was writing. And I had written my personal statement for medical school. And I remember giving it to her, and I was thinking, well, hey, this is the one thing I'm really good at. I can write. That's my skill. Because I actually started off as an English major before I switched over to biology. So that's where I felt the most comfortable. And I wrote this story about me and for medical school, and I gave it to Irene to go over. And she came back and she threw the personal statement at me, almost as if she was angry with me. She says, do it over. And I said, why? What's wrong with it? And she told me that I was apologizing really for my existence. And I remember when she told me how the tears began to flow from my face because I didn't know that I was doing that. I told her, I said, well, I thought that I was supposed to be responsible. And this is that feeling of being beat up all the time. I'm thinking that I got to explain to people why I didn't do good in this way or didn't do well in this. And I thought everybody wanted an explanation. And she says, yes. She says, you can say it and you can move on. She says, but never apologize for being here. She says, you belong and you deserve it, period. And it was the first time I think that, first of all, that I ever confronted the fact that I felt that way. Because when you live that type of existence where you're apologizing for your existence and when you're quiet and, the silence that I spoke about, when we even saw the writing on the wall and never really feeling like you can speak up and always being the only one everywhere you go, you don't know that you feel these things until someone challenges you with it. And that was my first time. And I think that was a transformational moment because it was a moment that I at least began to at least tell myself, hey, you do belong. And that I could then use that as an affirmation that would carry me throughout the rest of my life. I wouldn't always believe it, Stefan, but I would at least challenge myself because she reminded me that I struggled with that. And so that was one of my more powerful moments.
Yeah, there's this gap story, or there's this element in all of the stories that you've told where you have put up with things, worked around them, kept your mouth shut when you saw extraordinarily offensive signage on your way to school, with the understanding that it was not to be talked about, that this fixed set of situations in which you don't fully belong is just to be taken as a given. And then when you finally get your chance to take a crack at the golden ring or the brass ring, you're apologizing for not looking like exactly what the objective standard is. But these two agents come in. One is God, at least God as you conceived of her or him.
Yes.
And then the other is Irene.
Yes.
And God is simply, in that moment, letting you express yourself. And Irene is saying, you're going to have to believe that you deserve this now.
Yeah, right.
To hear about how LaMenta has taken the lessons that she's learned to help so many other young people by starting the I Am Able Foundation, please continue on to episode 2.